Well, let me just say we'll continue to on the second round. I yield to the congressman from California, ranking member, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paulson, you know, with our previous two testimony witnesses, obviously Chairman Bernanke found himself in an odd situation of saying, although Mr. Cuomo had said that the threat that you had said, and I'll quote it as best I can, from his letter, Secretary Paulson has informed us that he made the threat at the request of Chairman Bernanke. Now that came from Cuomo's office, and I apologize that his work was a little sloppy. We get a letter, but there's no transcript, there's no written record, so we have to take his interpretation of your statements, and that's one of the reasons you're here today. We also dealt with Ken Lewis, who came here with a situation in which he had received a threat by your own statements, and yet he had to say that the threat was not the reason that he went through with a bad deal, for if he had said that, then the Ohio pension funds and others that have sued, saying that the merger diminished their ownership, their asset value in Bank of America, would have in fact had their lawsuit go forward much more readily. So each of you before you have been in an odd situation. You're uniquely positioned to help us. One, you've told us, yes, you did issue the threat. Two, you believe that it was reasonable. And I want to put it in perspective just for a moment, perhaps for historical purposes, go back to the first Gulf War of 1990, in which Margaret Thatcher said to President George Herbert Walker Bush, "Don't go wobbly on me, George," when she felt that he was not prepared to pursue a war against Saddam after he invaded and brutally treated the people of Kuwait. This was not a war, but this was an emergency situation. Your threat is admitted. Your threat was because you felt that there were clearly disaster if they didn't go forward with it. One more thing I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that and how Mr. Cuomo came to give us the line he did. As my understand is, had the MAC clause been completely valid, had Ken Lewis renegotiated, had they agreed to a new terms or to a breakup, isn't it true that, in fact, we would have had a long period of time, statutory notice for stockholders, and then a stockholder vote occurred?
Yeah, there is. If there had been a renegotiation, there would have been an extended period, and there would have been a revote, is my understanding.
And isn't it that which is at the center of why you issued the threat and why Ken Lewis ultimately decided that the damage from that period, even if he got a better price or broke it, either way could be disastrous to both firms?
Well, the reason, and again, I don't. Ken Lewis didn't characterize it as a threat, and I.
No, actually, he didn't. He did characterize it as a threat. He managed to say that he didn't feel threatened while receiving a threat.
I prefer to characterize it as me explaining the Fed's supervisory authorities to him. But in any event, whatever we.
I like Margaret Thatcher's way of doing it myself.
However we characterize it, that the concern that I had was that the MAC clause wasn't a legally viable option. There's no precedent for it. There's no basis for it, and so doing that would have just would have been. It would have shown a lack of judgment, and I think it would have really undermined the viability of B of A and Merrill Lynch and the financial system.
Well, going back to Mr. Cuomo's characterization of what you had to say, if you can help us, if you will, thread the needle between these two, and before my time is up, I want to ask one other question, sort of an easy one. Would you say that effectively, no matter what the reason, the viability of the MAC, you were saying the equivalent of what Margaret Thatcher said to George W. Bush, which is stay the course, get this done. It's better to do it right now than not.
Yeah, let me go to explaining the confusion with Secretary Cuomo's office. It's really quite simple, because the Fed had invoked a privilege that kept me from recounting my conversation with Ben Bernanke to Cuomo's office. So if it hadn't been for that Fed privilege, I would have told and would have said to the Secretary, to Attorney General Cuomo's office exactly what I'm saying here today. And so I think it's really quite understandable that that this discrepancy in light of the Fed privilege. And right after Attorney General Cuomo's letter came out, I made a public statement where I said that my prediction of what could happen to Lewis and the board, that was from me, those were my words, but it was based upon what I understood to be the Fed's very strong opposition to B of A renouncing the deal. Now, and now to your last question, I was attempting to send a very strong message to Ken Lewis in terms of how strongly the Fed and Treasury viewed this matter. And so, and it wasn't just the words that about the Fed's supervisory powers, the other language which I presented at that time, which again, very strong message on the legal, the lack of the MAC being a legally viable option, very strong message on it being a lack of judgment, and a very strong message on what I believed and what the Fed believed this would do to Bank America and Merrill Lynch and the financial markets.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman